Those readers who do not accept the gravity of the moment will probably have slammed this book shut in disgust by now. Many of those readers who do accept Forrester's reality will, however, have already asked themselves what they can do to help either the world system, themselves, or both. It is a puzzling question because, as Forrester points out, many humanitarian impulses seem to be making matters worse in the long run. How can we as individuals take effective action? There are three obvious temptations. One is to crusade and demonstrate in an effort to influence those in power, those in the driver's seat of the machine. But considering the experiences of the past decade, one has to question this action's effectiveness. Also, this action is based on the assumption that someone does have the power to steer or stop. The same assumption underlies action of a second tempting sort, to revolt, to try to wrest the power from the hands of the seemingly blind and unwise. Is the attempt reasonable, and would the result be effective? One has to answer for oneself. These actions are particularly tempting because they suggest the possibility of rapid solution. How likely is rapid solution? The third action, and the one which this book is intended to support, is humbler in nature. It accepts the state of out of control. It accepts the impossibility of a rapid solution. It expects no solution to emanate out of the center of our centralized world because it considers the center as a large part of the problem. This action is intended to dissolve the center, and yet it accepts the small scale of the single individual's effectiveness. It is not aggressive, but defensive. It accepts the treacherousness of the impulse to help, and is rather concerned with stopping to hurt. In a word, the action is to decentralize, to refuse to support the centralized structures around us, to refuse to buy centralization. How many people so impressed with their ballot as a vote never stop to think that every dollar they spend is a vote? Garbed in all its seeming irresponsibility, the action is to drop out. Garbed in all its potential self-righteousness, the action is to begin the job of rebuilding. As those who have hastily tried it have found out, however, decentralizing oneself, one's family, or one's friends is not easily done. In fact, it is almost impossible. Perhaps it is like washing the blood from one's hands. Homesteading offers a humble way in which an individual family can most effectively remove his support from centralized structure. But why is it so difficult? That it can be done is a foregone conclusion because it has been done for some 5,000 years and is now being done by most world citizens. Why in the United States, with all the benefits, quote-unquote, of modern technology, has the return to a simpler life, quote-unquote, become so difficult? To seek an answer, let's look at what the process of centralization has done to cultures. The oldest course offered at Harvard is one that, at least in 1967, was not offered anywhere else in the United States. It is a strange course and little subscribed to. Its subject matter has largely fallen from academic circles and generates little enthusiasm in the modern student body. And yet I felt and continue to feel that I, especially as an English major, was extremely lucky to have taken that course. At the time, for one thing, it kept me sane. The course offered in a forgotten corner of the Peabody Museum is Plants and Human Affairs. The professor, Dr. Richard Schultes, opens the semester with a most unusual view of history, a view from the perspective of an economic botanist. Columbus invaded America because of pimenta negra, the black pepper plant, he instructs, and the north end of Boston is Irish because of the potato, which subsequent to Columbus's invasion was brought from Peru to Ireland, made Ireland dependent on it, and then as a monolithic crop failed her, Boston was the only out. During Professor Schultes' first lectures of the year, chuckles of incredulity passed through the students. This guy can't be real. And yet he has a point. It is a humbling view of human history, and yet it is certainly as valid a perspective as the political view of history. In fact, it cannot be denied that the availability of certain plants has been determinants in human cultures. Driving through Europe, the American tourist enjoys, but perhaps does not analyze, the fact that he passes from a grape culture through an olive culture to a wheat culture, which is not to say that all that changes is the appearance of the fields he passes by. No. In much of Europe, whole material cultures are still closely allied with the plants that support them. In the United States, it is romantic to think of how different is the culture of the cowboy and the eastern dairy farmer. True, when they work, they dress differently, but how far beyond that does the difference go? Actually, I think it goes a long way still. But part of the concern of this book is the process of cultural centralization, not only the present state of it. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let's go way back to look at cultures. As we have seen, before 10,000 years ago, in a sense, all men had one culture, that of hunting. This statement is probably true in its generality, though unquestionably human cultures depended greatly on the species hunted. But in those times, before even ceramics, human material cultures were so limited that there could be very little material expression of cultural differences. I would assert that human cultures, like languages, have in the past always been much, much more varied than they are now. In any case, within at most the last 25,000 years, material cultures have distinguished themselves. The first significant cultural change in this time was the development of the long-distance weapon, the bow and arrow, which first made the individual human family a conceivable, though unlikely, economic unit. This technological development appears to have come out of the Aterian culture of some of the last remaining Neanderthal men of the Atlas Mountains. It may have been given to us by this different, soon to become extinct species. The bow and arrow, however, like the other major subsequent technological changes, developed independently in other parts of the world. Then, between 10,000 and 5,000 years ago, most of the world's human inhabitants changed from the hunting superculture to that of agriculture and domesticated animals, and in the process developed independently in many areas ceramics, basketry, and weaving. Material cultural diversity was immediately expressed in what plants were domesticated, what animals domesticated. The Europeans very early domesticated cows and goats. The Aztecs, up until the time of the European conquest, had no domesticated dairy animals. Virtually all cultures domesticated dogs. What styles and techniques were used in pots and baskets? It is interesting to speculate why, after nearly 500,000 years of applying his large brain to hunting, man should within the last 5,000 years suddenly turn to agriculture. I question the assumption that man recognized agriculture as offering a better lifestyle, and so, as soon as it became available, he grasped it. Rather, I suspect the domestication of grasses could have occurred long before, but that man, as a hunter, was in equilibrium with the ecosystem and, as a species, had no need nor desire to change. I suspect that cultural change is almost always forced, and it's something, therefore, must have upset the equilibrium. Perhaps it was the bow and arrow, its creation of the individual and the individuals as opposed to the group's influence on the process of natural selection. If an individual, driven out of a group, had a chance to survive, the result could have been a new population pressure, which may have eventually forced the hunter to give up meat for grass seed. The subsequent technological changes, which have traditionally been credited with enormous cultural changes, were the discovery and use of metals, copper, bronze, and iron, though iron meant basically more of the same. Of course, the importance of metals became very much of a centralizing force. Metal ores are not distributed as evenly as land, sunshine, and rainfall, and considering the advantage metals gave to both aggression and defense, it became selectively advantage for a given culture to acquire its quota. The use of metals brought on intensive trade, and trade intensive culture crossing. Culture crossing, or transculturalization, leaves its mark on a material culture. The form or embellishment on a ceramic pot is an evidence of a material culture, and an archaeologist can follow the movements of cultures by the changes produced in the ceramics. Sometimes he can identify two cultures that mix. The result of transculturalization, like the crossing of frames of reference, is usually creative, something nearly universally frowned upon until the last 200 years or so. There is, however, some evidence to suggest that if too much transculturalization occurs, regression and degeneration are induced, although, of course, these words imply a scale of values. In this sense, it is perhaps useful to think of cultures as organisms or species which can absorb and are stimulated by a certain amount of mutation, but which can be destroyed by too much. On the strong cultural base of Europe, from the beginning of trade in metals to the invasion of the New World, quote unquote, transculturalization generated creativity, and the cultural changes were absorbed. The regression known as the Dark Ages is perhaps put into better perspective if one considers the burst of creativity in Greece and Rome's subsequent overextension as equally away from the norm. Both, then, appear as noise on the curve, territorial interplay caused by differential absorption of technical change. Then the supreme example of creativity generated by transculturalization, the discovery, from the Europeans' viewpoint, of and subsequent, quote, settlement, unquote, of the New World. When Columbus met the American Indians, two trunks of cultural development in Homo sapiens, isolated for tens of thousands of years to follow their own course, met. It is extraordinary how similar those trunks were, how parallel had been cultural development, and yet the cultural differences were great enough to bring about a period of creativity which not only human cultures, but the biosphere itself may never be able to absorb. Professor Schultes delights in the knowledge of his apparent eccentricity as he explains that before 1500, Europe had no sugar, nor sweetener besides honey and malt, that it had no coffee, tobacco, potato, corn, the mainstay of modern husbandry, nor chocolate. The New World, of course, received in turn its share of technological and cultural innovations, the larger share, no doubt, but for which it paid dearly in human and cultural obliteration. After 1500, the speed and power of technological and cultural change had become so great that we cannot consider the events individually. Rather, change has come in rapid waves. Each wave has left its legacy of cultural drowned. It has been within this brief last period, and especially within the second part of it, that cultures have gradually lost their roots in location. Where metals and luxury goods were traded across cultures, now everything is traded. Extensive trade, its subsequent specialization of geographic areas, and its resulting simplification of local economies has left many areas too simplified to be able to sustain a culture of any richness of its own. The culture reflects the scale of its economy, which is largely national, becoming worldwide. And there's where I'll stop for today. See you next time.